Hi everyone, I'm Adam Dilshan. I was the captain of the Royal College debating team. I am a member of the Sri Lankan national team for the year 2026, and I currently coach Gateway College Dehiwala. So I will be doing a motion debrief for the quarterfinals of AISDC. The motion reads: the SOS prefers the unification of Up-Country and Eelam Tamils into a singular Sri Lankan pan-Tamil political identity over individual community identities. So I'll first talk about setup for both sides, then I'll talk about the arguments. On setup, I think there are two important questions. The first question is, when does this motion take place? I think on prop, you have to frame that even though it's a prefers motion, it does not take place from the start of time. Because if you run this debate in the 20th century, you have to support the up-country movement joining the separationist movement, which is a very high burden to prove that it's objectively a good thing and that it's a feasible outcome, that the mesh will sort of happen in a way that's going to be feasible. So I think the more reasonable way you can make the debate is to say that it takes place right now, that in status quo, there's going to be this coalition between the Up-Country Tamils and the Eelam Tamils, and you will create this singular Sri Lankan pan-Tamil political identity. On opposition, you can run the framing that is from the inception of time, i.e. like when the movement started forming, but the debate will then have a huge characterization clash. So I think it's more charitable for Op to sort of buy into the framing that sure, it takes place right now, it can happen in the past, if it does we win easily, but we'll debate that this happens right now for the sake of the motion. And I think this is possible because there are also very easy Op strategies to win with this framing. The second question then is the way in which this mesh happens. I think there's fiat on the proposition side to say that this will happen in ways that are going to be quite organic, that the leaders would come together, have these discussions, and create this identity together, that there'll be some shared elements of leadership, but even though these shared elements do exist, that it's fair to say that the majority of power will likely exist with the Eelam Tamils, and that is something that Op can run that I think Prop also has to buy into. So we'll talk about Prop first, and then we'll go into opposition. So on Prop, there are two arguments that I would run. The first argument is that the unification is good for the Malaiyaha community, or the up-country Tamil community. The framing here is that the up-country Tamil community is around 600,000 people, and they don't have a massive political capital in isolation. That is because, one, they have very limited land and space, they are massively struggling with these regards, they have very little infrastructure. Two is because they just have a lower amount of people, so in terms of a political body, in isolation, they can't garner a lot of political traction. And three is that they don't have many people in positions of influence. There are some people that have some influence, but in comparison, they don't have a lot of voices when it comes to within parliaments and the ability for them to garner some kind of support for themselves. So the upshot to this is that even though they have their own communities and their own individual mayoral elections, they can't expand further than this if they don't choose a side. So the important push here is you need to push opposition, that opposition needs to defend status quo, where if this community remains in isolation, they suffer with very little progress, like what we've seen, in building their towns with poor infrastructure, education, and all of the opportunities, and their rights in general are quite low as well. So the upshot here again is that on both sides, the up-country community will have to be reliant on someone and the benevolence of some community, if not themselves. So the debate should be that whether the up-country Tamils should pick the Eelam community to sort of get support from, or the single majority parties in Sri Lanka. So even if they remain as an independent movement in opposition's world, they have very little autonomy, so they have to pick some side. So I think there are two comparatives you can prove here then. The first question is, why are the Eelam Tamils going to have some incentives to help the up-country Tamils? I think there are a few things you can say. You can concede cultural differences. You can say that obviously we aren't exactly alike, there are some differences, but there are some similarities as well that can help bridge this gap. For example, you speak the same languages, even though there are some inflection differences, the language is the same. And there are religious similarities, that you have shared experiences on historic oppression by the majority. But I think the most compelling reason here is that the peak of the conflict took place several decades ago, and that right now the animosity has likely died down as generations have changed, and therefore the problem isn't that significant. The second question I think you need to answer is why the Sinhala majorities have less incentives in comparison to the Eelam community to help the up-country Tamils. I think one, you can say that the Sinhala majorities have very little to gain from helping the up-country communities. And that there are very little similarities they have between them. They have no shared history that will motivate any specifically powerful incentives. You can also say that a lot of the Sinhala majority parties still harbor racist intentions towards the Tamil populations. Even if this is not overt, it's likely going to be quite covert and quite implicit in the way they react and interact with the communities, which means the incentives are not going to be as powerful either. What you can also say is that a lot of the electoral box of these parties might not like their political parties prioritizing the Tamil populations over themselves, and therefore the political parties' incentives are not to prioritize the Malayali communities. So what you're basically trying to prove here is that maybe the Eelam Tamils aren't perfect in facilitating the Up-Country Tamils, but they're definitely comparatively better than the singular majority, and there's a significant difference here. The second thing you can prove in this argument is that the Malaya leaders or the Up-Country leaders are also kind of corrupt sometimes, that they use and exploit their people with very little accountability and checking mechanisms, and the majority have no incentive, the singular majority have no incentives to out them or keep them in check. Rather, what you can say is that on proposition, there are at least more checking mechanisms against this after the unification, because the Eelam Tamils' political image is likely tied to the treatment of the Up-Country Tamils' political image, and therefore you want to make sure that these are checked against, that there's no exploitation, that after the unification happens, there is very little exploitation of the people that you're ruling over. So the impact of all of this is that on opposition, the leaders of the Up-Country Tamils will continue to exploit the most vulnerable people in their communities, while there's comparatively higher increase in accountability on proposition, even if it's not perfect. The second argument I would run is that this is good for the progression of the greater Tamil community. The idea here is that you have more unity and less diversification between the communities, and you have to prove why this is a good thing as well. So two things here then. The first is we have a larger mass of a Tamil population, that when they stand together, they can make a significant increase in their political capital as a result of them becoming bigger and becoming a bigger electoral bloc. But the problem here then that you can sort of push is that when two groups are divided, neither have manifested their full potential or their voting influences. So therefore, as a coalition, they become stronger, and as a result of this, they can push for better rights, they can collectivize, demand for the same things, and pressure the ruling parties to direct more funding towards that direction. The second thing you can say is that there's a higher chance of having an Up-Country Tamil politician in parliament, that the Eelam Tamils will want to keep the Up-Country satiated, the people of the community happy, and therefore they want to make them feel like they're actually doing something for them. The reason they want to do this is because, one, they actually want to gain the support of the people of the community to maximize their political power, but two, they also don't want internal conflict, because this is also not good for their images, it's not good for their people, and therefore they want to make sure that conflict is as minimized as possible. And the way they can do this then is not by ignoring the people, even if they want to, but rather by giving them some level of representation. So the upshot to this again is that in proposition's world, there's incentives for the Eelam Tamil to increase and give some level of up-country representation in the parties and push them to get elected into the parliament too. And this is fantastic to the representation of the up-country Tamils. So I think these are like two arguments you can run. You need to be very cautious about trade-offs though. I do think that you have to trade off that there likely is going to be some level of issues internally within the party, that this is not going to be a short-term thing, rather that's going to be long-term change, and the long-term change is worth it. And in the grand scheme of things, weigh heavily on the fact that the treatment or the conditions of the up-country Tamils is so poor that even if they're abused to some extent or exploited to some extent by the Eelam Tamils, it's completely worth it, because the harm of having terrible infrastructure, no education, bad healthcare, no land, and all of these issues is significantly worse than anything else. So on opposition, there are two arguments as well. The first argument that I would run is that the unification will worsen the conditions of the up-country Tamils. You can prove two things here. The first is that people degrade the up-country Tamil people a lot, especially among the Jaffna Tamils, because you don't consider them as equal people because of historical indifferences and all of those things that push the fact that, you know, these are people not from our country, these are people from India that don't really deserve our rights. So the idea here is that there's a very deep-rooted animosity passed down from generation to generation, and that they also feel an intrinsic sense of moral superiority. And the impact of this is that you're forcing the communities to interact with each other would massively hurt the up-country Tamils, because they are the ones that are the most likely to face microaggressions and potential violence, and this is worse because the up-country Tamils are at the benevolence of the Eelam Tamils, so you can't do much about it in the instance where you are being exploited or you have to face violence or microaggressions. The second thing you can say then is that cultural divisions and caste systems exist, which means it's very difficult to mesh with one another, which means the ability to marry one another is very, very little, that the interactions in schools are likely going to be going to have a large level of animosity. And the idea here is that in close proximity, these divisions are going to be significantly more prominent, and they're also going to be highlighted, which is likely going to lead to some level of conflict. Either it's going to be political or it's going to happen on a lot more individual basis. So the problem then is that if conflict happens, the up-country Tamils are the ones that are most likely going to be hurt because they are more vulnerable and they lack the support to protect themselves compared to the more larger, more influential Eelam Tamils. The second argument is why the unification dilutes any political traction the Up-Country Tamils have garnered. A few things here as well. I think one thing you can prove here is that you'd rather side with the majority parties. That as the Up-Country Tamils, there's a lot more you can gain from signing with the National Party or the NPP. You can see that right now in status quo, the NPP does help the Up-Country Tamils to some extent, and this is a good thing, and that there's long-term possibility and potential for gaining more support. For example, you can say that the biggest Malayala party leader is Sendil Tondaman, and that he can get better positions in the instance where he supports the ruling party. But there is an opportunity cost to joining the Eelam Tamils, which is sacrificing the NPP and other political parties, which is the ruling party and has a lot more influence in being able to give you benefits. So the strategy here is to co-opt all of the incentives that proposition gives you and prove why the singular parties also want to give the Malayala communities some representation. The second thing you can prove here is that you want different stuff, that you have different priorities between the Up-Country Tamils and the Eelam Tamils. That the Up-Country Tamils want more tangible and common things like lands, like working rights, like employment and infrastructure. But the Eelam Tamils are in a lot more privileged positions, they don't have the same problems, and therefore you can't reconcile these needs. And the issue here is that the Up-Country Tamils probably won't mind participating with the majoritarians if they can get in other rights, and given that their position isn't that great, it's probably worth it for them to join the majority to get the basic rights that they deserve. So the way you can prove this is to say that as a result of not meshing well together, given the analysis we have in our first argument, internal fighting will likely dilute the advocacy and make the advocacy less specific, which means you ask for less specific things, which means you get things that are less going to inject less good into the Malaya community and give them that benefit, which means that in general the advocacy becomes less effective. The final thing you can say is that even if the unified coalition comes into power and they gain some influence, you will not help the Up-Country Tamils as much. The reason for this is because in the instance where the unification becomes successful, it is going to be the Eelam Tamils that have most of the power, because it's probably most of the resources that is fueled into these political parties. It's the people that probably rule the parties the most. And as a result of all of these things, the Eelam Tamil will likely only focus on their issues, because it's better electoral to focus on their people because the number is much larger than the Malaya community. So even if you give them something, it's likely going to be breadcrumbs and not going to actually fix their problems. And that on weighing, it is better that we have an individual, isolated party that can then demand for our specific needs and get those needs tailored for our benefits. And you can talk about why these needs are not going to be addressed on the side of proposition. So I think this is how the debate can go. You have to be very conscious about being as charitable as possible about certain things, on going on the even ifs, and not being afraid to take those risks and trade-offs. But yeah, I think it would be quite a fun debate. Happy debating.